Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So my next interview is with Nicole Salmon, Anika Allen, and Camila Pereira. And we had a whole lot of fun chatting about a new project called Collecting Courage. It's a book. It's a collection of stories. And it all happened on St. Patrick's Day, which I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but I do think, if I remember correctly on the Zoom interview, none of us were wearing green. So perhaps there's more going on than meets the eye there. But you know what? We talk about so many things. Mostly we talk about this project, which you can find more out about, called collectingcourage.org. And you need to stay tuned because we've got a special event coming up in April. You're going to be hearing more about it on my podcast, but you're also going to be seeing some advertising about it, I hope and trust. And it's going to be a live event happening, a face-to-face live event, which is happening more and more regularly now, at least once a month, sometimes twice. April 16th, 12:30 to 2. You'll be able to register on Eventbrite. We talk about this film. We talk about the people who are writing, I'm going to say, a counter narrative. We talk about why enough is enough, and about public outings, and about why it's so important to, keep our eyes wide open. We talk about truth and experience, and about the story of relationships, and about how the time is always going to be now, and what does it mean to see the world and to see others through a lens of hearing, of being aware, and I, not only is this book a book of stories, it's a book of conversations, and that's what this is about. It is about the thread of racism that runs deep and as I think Nicole said, runs far. We talk about things like historic exclusion. I mean, what is that? I mean, let's peel back the surface and go a little deeper about proximity being the problem. And we get into the practicalities of what's happening in fundraising in the charitable sector and anti-racism and this notion of action and inaction. And believe me, it's sounding maybe, I don't know, a little heady and very academic, and it was, but it was just full of laughter, and we just had a lot of fun as well. And I think that's a really important testament to the joy, the love, and that this group of rare, very talented writers and authors bring to this project. So stay tuned and listen in. You're gonna love this group, and you're going to want to get your hands on this book. And I really hope and trust there's going to be some really cool swag coming out of this conversation as well down the road. I know I want to get my coffee mug, and I know everybody is, Anika, Camila, and Nicole are probably sick of hearing about the coffee mug, but I think folks, I think it's coming. Anyway, check them out a little bit more online, collectingcourage.org. You can get the book there as well. Anika Allen, Camila Pereira, and Nicole Salmon. Don't forget, my new website has just launched. You can get there a variety of ways, but davidpecklive.com. But really, you're probably arriving through iTunes or maybe facetofacelive.ca. And you can go a little deeper there. Sign up for the newsletter. 500 and, 47 interviews or something like that. Maybe we've even crossed the 550 mark. Reach out if you'd like to advertise. And you know what? Most importantly, what we would love from you is to like us on YouTube and also to leave us a review on iTunes. That would be brilliant. We'd appreciate it, and it would go a long way. And don't touch that dial. An anthology that's lyrical, poetic, and beautifully written. Coming right up, a conversation with Anika Allen, Camila Pereira, Nicole Salmon here on Face to Face, Collecting Courage. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We are joined by several very special guests here with us today, editors and authors of a new collection that you're going to want to get your hands on called Collecting Courage. We have Camila Pereira, Anika Allen, and Nicole Salmon here on Face to Face Live. Thank you so much for all of you for joining me here today.
So glad to join you, David.
So I've been really looking forward to this conversation for a lot of reasons. And as most of my listeners will know, I've worked in and around the nonprofit sector for about 20 years. I've taught international development at Humber College. I've worked with some, mostly small agencies, but a few very large agencies as well. So at kind of both ends of the spectrum. So when I saw your book, and I think it was a mutual friend, a nice little shout out for Mazarine Trays, Wild Woman Fundraising. Is that right, Anika?
Right.
Yeah. Check Mazarine out. She's a force to be reckoned with. So folks, you need to look her up. But she introduced me to you, and immediately the title had me. And I would love to hear from each of you or one of you. How did the project sort of develop, and what did it come out of? I've got my ideas, of course, but Anika, how about you step right into it? Tell us where the genesis of this project finds itself.
So great question, David. The genesis of Collecting Courage really emerges out of a project called Our Right to Heal. And that was a project that a group of us, all of us on the call today, participated in with the Association of Fundraising Professionals. And, when that project essentially was 10 first-person narratives from Black Canadian fundraisers talking about their experiences of racism, but predominantly with the lens of healing, how they what methods they employ to heal and to survive the charitable sector. And so that project launched in May of 2020, 1 week before George Floyd died. And so, the world sort of opened up in a new way, or I should say the ears of the world opened up in a new way. And as a result, Gail Pico, who is our editor, caught wind of our project. And Nicole loves to share sort of the parallel track to the project, Our Right to Heal, and how Gail's, emerged onto the scene and how Collecting Courage came to be.
Thanks, Anika. Yes, it's funny, the story of Collecting Courage, when you think of it as being a story of fundraisers, sharing their truth and experiences in the sector, it's really a story about relationships too. So that's how the book came into being. I have known Gail Pico for just over 20 years, and Gail had written the book Cap in Hand, and the group of Black Canadian Fundraisers Collective, we had selected Gail's book in December 2019, I believe, as the book that we would review. And because of my connection with Gail, I invited her to join us. And she was just, she was just pleased to be there, to be surrounded by so many amazing Black female fundraisers. And she at that point talked about, something she was thinking of in terms of a compilation of stories featuring Black fundraisers. So that idea got floated at that point. In February 2020, of course, Gail launched the charity report. And at the same time, she was making some headway into creating her own book publishing business as a part of, as an imprint of Civil Sector Press. So that was Gail K. Pico Books. And as Anika said, Gail was quite aware of the Our Right to Heal project. George Floyd happened, and by June, Gail was on the phone with me saying essentially, Nicole, I think the time is now. And I thought, yeah, I think the time is now. And I got off the phone with Gail, connected immediately with Anika, and then Anika sort of sent it out to our group. And as I love to say, Camilla jumped on board, and we're so exceedingly pleased that she did. So that's how you have the three of us with you today.
I love Nicole, how you say, and for me, this has been so prominent over the last, I'd say, 7 to 10 years. And even as I dig more into face-to-face, Richard Wagamese said stories are meant to heal. Yes. Canadian Indigenous writer. And how do we get to counter narratives and I'm going to say merely, and I hope you know what I mean by that, but merely by telling our story.
Yeah.
And Anika, I love too the ears, and I'd love to hear Camila, what you think about this. But Anika said the ears of the world opened in a new way. Camila, can you unpack that a little bit for us about how, if you have ears to hear, right?
Yeah, I think with what happened with George Floyd, it was just everywhere, and there was no way that people would not talk about it. I think it was so in everyone's face that it also created an opportunity to really initiate a much more significant conversation, right? It didn't start with him. We had before him, we had Breonna Taylor, and we had many others for years and decades. But I think that the sort of it was the power imposed over him, the suffering, and everything that was involved in that situation really created a moment when the entire world uh, literally said, "This enough is enough." And I think that for us, and that's how I actually met them. We've been looking into the healing process. I would say, like since I started in the sector, I've been looking and trying to figure out like where are other women like me. That's how I met them actually, because we're always looking for support. We're looking into leaning on each other, and between us, we already share our stories. But I think it was time to share with the world, right? And it was interesting because when we were doing the launching of the book, that's the day it really sank. I was just like, oh my God, it's out there. And I think the timing was just really, I don't want to use the word perfect because it might not sound right, but you know what I mean? It was just a very special and timing moment for us to be like, okay, this is what is happening to us.
Yeah.
The way it all came to be, the way the book came together, the sharing our experiences with Canadian and also American sister friends, I think it makes it even more, the project and the importance and the content and what we have to say, much more powerful. This is our truth.
I love that. That should be the T-shirt. This is our truth. By the way, have you guys got merchandise to sell? I haven't seen that on the website yet. I want my coffee mug. Yeah.
We want our coffee mug too.
Yes.
Right.
And the T-shirt, but the coffee mug definitely.
Yeah, let's work on that. I think there could be a fundraising campaign here. Yeah. I'd love to know what the response has been to the book, and has there been? Okay, sorry, I'm going to go a little negative. You guys are realists, clearly, but you're joyful realists. I love that about all of you. I can tell by your smiles, your demeanor. I can tell by the book. I can tell by the poetry in the book. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps, thinking about it. So you've stepped into a bit of a mess, frankly, and yet you eyes wide open, and it seems like you're all smiling while you're doing it. And that's a remarkable thing to me. And so I would love to hear, at the risk of going negative, I would love to hear what the response to the book has been like.
Mm-hmm. Nicole, you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll start off, and my sisters will certainly build on it. I think the response has been good. It's been mixed. Are we surprised? I don't think we are, right? Because we're putting something out there that has never been out there in such a public way, right? The conversations have been happening within our community for a long time, talking about these things, but this is a very public outing of something we know was existing. So I think the conversation has been mixed. A lot of people, we've gotten amazingly positive feedback saying this was the time this needed to be said. We have also gotten some silence, right, from within the sector, right? And it's not for me to interpret what that silence means, but I have an idea. Some people may be taken aback, right? They don't know what to say. Or there may be a situation where, in not knowing what to say, nothing happens. So let us not just even talk about it, because if we talk about it, it means we have to acknowledge these experiences and these truths. And sometimes that's a very difficult thing for people to do. Now, the fact is, I think we went into this project with our eyes wide open, right? So we had our expectations, and there are no limits to those expectations, right? So that's a wonderful thing. But we also went into it understanding that we were trying to build something. We were gaining momentum, and that takes time. And that sometimes takes us through bumpy roads. So again, we are a people, we come from a people who have had setbacks or things have not gone smoothly. So we were sort of prepared. Not sort of, we were prepared for that to happen. So we are prepared to hang in there, to keep going and to keep speaking, because we're just scratching the surface. So I'll leave it there and then have Anika and Camilla pick up.
Just to pick up on the question about joy, collecting courage is a documenting. It's a documenting of our lives. And it's a documenting of what's happened to us, but also what is happening to us, right? And I think that in, raising our voices and having the capacity to speak our truth, in laid in that is liberty. And so in that freedom is joy.
True. Liberty with so I'm not looking for a syllogism here, but freedom, truth, freedom, joy, they're kind of all connected, it seems to me. And yet if I hear what Nicole was saying, and I've certainly come up against this, tell me anyone who wants to be called out or called up. In fact, I think you guys are doing that. And I know it can be cliche and trite. You're not calling people out, you're calling them up. Okay, your ears are open. Now what are you going to do? Are you going to step into this? There is a responsibility here as well. Oh, and by the way, why don't you do it with the spirit of joy, which is really hard to do when you're on the other side and somebody's saying, not that you're less than, but in a sense, I guess you're not measuring up. This is unjust. How are you going to respond? Maybe this is a nice segue into this notion. I'd love to hear more about this notion of a historic exclusion in the charitable sector. Camila, can you step into that for me? What does that even mean? I love where that takes me. But could you help our audience and me to understand that a little more?
I think it starts with how the charitable sector is seen and has always been composed of. The charitable sector is a very wide space, and I think that's the beginning of the conversation. If you look at our donors are mainly male and white. That's another conversation right there. So I think that the exclusion starts from the I want to say from the root of the sector. I'm gonna get my colleagues to jump in, but I see that it starts from there, where we are not part of, and then if you go inside the organization, and you look at leadership and you look at boards, it continues there, which sets direction, right? The direction which sets goals. So it's a structural, I would say, I think, issue that we have, that it's being addressed now. We see it often, people saying, no, we need more diverse boards. But I think that's the root of the problem.
I think Camila is quite right. And, what she's just described is a microcosm of society at large.
Exactly.
Right? And so, I think that is what we're getting at in collecting courage. And that is that the philanthropic or charitable sector is not an exemption. They are not exempt from the societal realities of anti-Black racism.
And is it fair to say too, that when you say microcosm, I think I mean, there's lots of lessons here in what your project is all about for everyone, it seems to me. So this is about Canadian, it's about North American, let's say, the North American charitable sector, but it seems to me there are lessons globally here, right? There's so much to take out of this. Yes, it's very specific in its critique and its observations, but not just for that microcosm. So in other words, this isn't just happening in the philanthropic sector. This is kind of across the board, right? That's sort of the assessment. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I think it is, David, because I think we talk about a thread, and the thread of racism runs deep and it runs far, right? So I think that's what we're saying here. And I think, these first person accounts that we have in this book is, as I said before, it scratches the surface, right? We could have had many more contributors to this book. We are scratching the surface. So this is there. And then why is this there, right? The question is, why do we find that we have a sector that demographically looks a certain way and has maintained that for a very, very long time, even when there's changing demographics, right? And it also, I want to also bring in this whole idea about power, because people will say, well, it's changing. Look, you're now seeing more people of color, Black fundraisers, Indigenous fundraisers. You're now seeing them in organizations. And the question then becomes, who in those organizations actually hold the power? That has remained exclusively white and male. It has remained that way for a long time. So when something is maintained and remains like that, you have to assume there are some barriers, there are some specific things being done, so specific actions and inactions that are happening that are causing that picture of the sector. The second thing I just wanted to sort of talk quickly about is the problem. So when the sector realizes that there is a problem here, what happens is the prognosis, the solution is seen as is based on the problem as they identify. So the problem is you don't have trained Black fundraisers or trained Indigenous fundraisers or people of color in the sector. So what we have to do is to provide training for those folks. It's just a simple thing of gap, right? And that's not true, because when you look at the folks that have, all the women and men that have contributed to this collection, you see these are accomplished Black people, extremely accomplished. As Camilla would say, they are all beyond excellent. And so you have to sort of say, if they're writing this, and these are the folks you're looking at, then what is happening? Why are people like that being excluded? So if you frame the problem as the fact there is a gap in the availability of Black fundraisers or fundraisers of color, then the solution is going to be, okay, well, let us get mentorship programs so that we can bring folks along. And we know that's not how the problem should be framed. And certainly that solution is not going to respond adequately to the problem.
Yeah, I find it really interesting you talk about action and inaction. And I wonder how much of, why we find ourselves in this place, which seems to be a little more positive than it was, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago. People are talking about it. It's a new conversation. The time is now. And I want to ask you about that, by the way. I think your book is going to sit on people's shelves with very little dust on it over the years, because I think the time's always going to be now, if that makes any sense. And I'd love for you guys to riff on that a little bit, because I think there's always aren't we always going to have these issues of one kind or another? It seems that we're going to be railing against. We hope not. Maybe in our lifetime we won't see, the real answers. Maybe our children, etc. But I hope we're not always rolling the rock up the hill. But anyway, the time is always going to be now. But Nicole, this idea of inaction. So the racism becomes then not even intentional. It's just built within. Right? It's deeply ideological. And that's where I think we're barely scratching the surface on this as a conversation. And, how do we continue to peel back those layers so that we just don't go back the way things were?
Yeah,
Yeah, please, Anika.
I have several thoughts on this.
Oh, I bet you do.
I'll offer.
and hey, we're not going to be able to get all those thoughts on one coffee mug.
That's right.
I'm just saying. Yeah.
I'm just going to offer you one. The work of being an anti-racist, which is not the same as being not racist, right? This is an active thing. This is a doing, right? Being anti-racist is a doing, and it's a doing. It's good for you as an individual, which means that the work is yours. And so I spend a great deal of my time working with people around identity and the context in which we find ourselves. And part of the way that we ensure that we remain committed to justice, because that's what this is all about, right?
It's good.
It's not about diversity. It's not about inclusion. It's not about equity. Equity is the way we want to get to justice, but justice is the goal.
Good. It's great. Love it.
Right? We have to understand who we are, where we are, and the understanding where we are means understanding the historical nature of where we find ourselves, which many of us are not called into either of those things for a matter of fact. How many people ask you about who you are as an individual, how you identify, and how that relates to your environment? Very few people, right? When we begin to understand those two things and find ourselves in the context and then apply a racial equity lens to that, your work becomes very evident. Your anti-racist work becomes evident, and you are propelled to be closer to the problem. I think Collecting Courage is an invitation to get in proximity to the problem of anti-Black racism. And so when I hear you say our book is going to be on people's shelves without very much dust, that makes me happy, because as long as we remain connected and we have proximity to the problem of anti-Black racism, we will continue to engage in the struggle for freedom and for justice.
Does Camila, does proximity to the problem, I love that, by the way, Anika, does that sort of presuppose that my ears are always going to be open?
I hope so. That's how I understand it. I think you need to first, you have to acknowledge that it's real, that it's there, that it exists, right? And I think when we're talking about the silence part of earlier, I think that's part of it. When you remain silent, you kind of like don't acknowledge it, right? Because once you do that, the next step for me is to take action. Somehow you can't hide away from it anymore. Well, I would say some might try, and I think the way you try, it's not engaging in conversation, but it's there. So how long can you actually keep yourself outside of it when it's all around you, right? Yeah. When at work it's being talked about, on TV it's being talked about. So I don't believe there's a way just to keep yourself out of it. And I think that's how our book will contribute to it. I think narratives, first person narrative, listen to people's stories and really giving not importance, but to their lived experiences is extremely important. I think we've been part of the exclusion that we felt. It's because our lived experiences are not taken into consideration. And I think once you start doing that, and I think, and to me, it's an exercise. It's a daily exercise, and because I think they're so used. I'm measuring my words here, as you can see. I think sometimes you're so used to a pattern, a behavior of how to approach things and deal with them. It's hard to catch yourself sometimes and just be like, oops, I'm doing this again. Yes. But I think that's what our stories are telling as well. Yeah. Right? Through our stories, you can see situations where once you've read it and you know of them, when you see it happening, you should say something, right?
But
If you're at that
deeply,
framework, if you're that's in that space that Anika was talking about of doing the anti-racist work, if you're in that space, that's when you step in because you recognize it and you can just not say
right.
anything anymore.
Well, I think empathy is where I went to while you were kind of talking about that. And how do we empathize? We listen, we shut the hell up,
Yep.
and we listen to the other, and we actually hear the story, and hopefully we say, hang on, I don't know what you mean by that. Tell me more. I've never heard that before, or whatever those penetrating questions are going to be. But that requires, I think, an openness. Nicole, do you think that people who read is Collecting Courage going to shock people out of their complacency? In other words, do people have to be already warmed up, if you will, to the message? Does that make sense? Because sometimes I wonder, oh man, we're just preaching to the converted again, and how do we get, I mean, one of the questions I wanted to get to eventually was, how do we affect real change? So I've only asked you about 6 questions, by the way, Nicole, so you can choose whichever one you want to answer.
Hey, thanks, David. So let me tackle, it's interesting because I'm listening to, I knew Anika was going to talk, because to me the heart of the question that you asked was around identity. And, we look to Anika because that's the work that she does all the time, and understanding that. And when you talk, and I love when she talks about proximity, and I wanted to just sort of build on what both of them have said. Proximity, what happens with proximity, it's not that you're going to be feeling great because you're going to be juxtaposed. You're going to be beside issues that you may not have heard before.
Sure.
Or you have ignored before.
Right. Yep.
Or you have no reason to pay attention.
Through action, or maybe inaction.
Through action or inaction.
Yep.
What's going to happen with that is, you're either going to sort of get a sense and you're going to feel uncomfortable because these things are not comfortable, but you have to depersonalize it. You have to personalize it and depersonalize it. It's work that you have to do if you are really committed to moving forward and changing things, right? Or you're going to just ignore it again. So when you come back to say about, the book, I'm hopeful that this book is going to be part of the conversation for a very long time. And people will come at it whenever they're ready. And they might be coming at it when they're not ready. Is it planting a seed? Is it warming something up for later? Something triggers something, right? That's okay too. That's why we talked about it being this long process, right? And I'll tell you this, we were in the process of, you're in the co-editor hat on. So it's a little bit different. And then at the same time, we're thinking about our individual pieces. And then when all of that was put together and all done, we all had the opportunity to just sit back and read the book, right?
Nice.
And experience the book. And honestly, David, every time we read it, and we've read it several times, it feels like you go deeper, and it feels like you learn more, right? And I think that is our hope, that the book, it will be one of those things that is passed around. It will have, tattered pages, they'll have little
post-it notes attached to it, scribbling inside.
Yeah, people will come back to it, right? And I think that's the hope. That's what change looks like, is revisiting these things and opening up yourself to sort of shifting your perspective and being prepared. Then once your perspective is shifted, you have to do something. Yeah, no, the call to action is not only implied, it's really quite explicit, actually. And everyone's going to step into it in a different way, right? Exactly.
Everyone's going to step into it. I so love that, Nicole. I love too, by the way, that your chapter, and help me out here, is a collection of poetry. Is that a fair way to put it in the book?
It's my poetry. Yeah.
Yes.
It's not,
yeah.
Yes, it's my poetry. Yeah.
It's really, really beautiful. And I'm going to read I'm going to read Stephen Grellett's piece here. Quote, I shall pass through this world but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, or any kindness that I can show to any human being, let me do it now. Let me not defer or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. I mean, the time is now, right? I mean, it sounds, on one level, I love that we're clearly all idealists, I think, here on some level, right? But you know what? This is the real world, and that's why I love this book, because it's got an academic edge, clearly. Incredibly smart, talented, thoughtful, insightful people have been a part of this, but it's rooted in personal narrative. And I bet you, Nicole, that's why you're discovering, when you go back to it, I wonder if there's something there. There's more going on than meets the eye to all of our stories. And I love that. I also love that I prepared about 15 questions and I've really only asked one of them, just so you know. So just saying. So I love that. I think I read in the intro to the book that through context comes understanding. What a beautiful phrase. To me, that sounds like one needs to listen. But I hear a lot going on in that phrase. Anika, did you write that? Was that your? I wondered.
I did write that, and it relates very much to what I was describing earlier about identity and understanding context and proximity. And, when we begin to understand, where we are, we then can begin to understand what we see around us. Right? You hear people say, "Oh, I can't believe that's happening in 2021. How is that happening?" Well, that's born out of a lack of understanding for the context. Right? And so to me, there's just such a great invitation into understanding the broader context, and the collection of our stories come together, formulate a picture of a context. In the introduction, I try to set sort of a frame around those stories so people can understand these aren't one-off, experiences. It's probably really important for you to know too, none of our authors knew what each other was going to write. Right. No one read anybody's work in advance. The only people who read the work in advance were the three of us. And it is not a coincidence that each story is sewn together, right, through a common experience of struggle and oppression. And so I know in my life, I have been invited into understanding the context so that I can better understand my condition. And so I think that is an invitation for everyone.
It's good. No, I think it's such wise advice for any sector, for any community member, for any family member, really, isn't it? I mean, and this is what I love about Collecting Courage. It's so applicable across the board. By the way, the website, help me out here though, is collectingcourage.org.
Yes.
Sadly, you can't buy a coffee mug there yet, but you can get a copy of the book. And yeah. So how, let's this idea too, of benevolence and the charitable sector, I found really fascinating in the book. And we are so not even going to scratch the surface. And I love that that's sort of what's happening in our conversation, never mind society, right? But anyway, benevolence just being sort of bestowed, I think, is the way you sort of refer it on the charitable sector. Can one of you talk about that? Because I think that's really an important takeaway from Collecting Courage, because it's like, can I say, are you guys, do any of you play Monopoly as kids? I love Monopoly.
Yeah.
Do we give the charitable sector a get out of jail free card? That's.
So I want to say just one thing, but I know probably Nicole and Camila both have something to say about this. So let's see if we can get it in, David. When I thought about this question, I was thinking about white saviorism, about Western philanthropy.
Sure. White man's burden.
Exactly, where that emerges from, right? And altruism. the one-way nature of altruism, right? All of that is flawed. You know, it's someone who has some power, some resources, deciding they're going to bend low, you know, to help the lowly people do the thing. When in reality, we're talking about injustice on the ground, right? And the question ought to be, what are we doing about the injustice on the ground? You know, people who are on the ground, oppressed by the injustice, have been organizing for centuries.
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And we organize and we fundraise and we create solutions for ourselves. We have reciprocal and mutual relationships. And we have a brand of philanthropy that predates this version of philanthropy that we know so well here in North America and in Europe and around the world for that matter. And so it's interesting to me, but it also makes sense to me that the narrative around this westernized version of philanthropy is one of benevolence, because it fits the narrative that they created around all those other elements I just explained. When in reality, in my reality, in our reality as Black women, philanthropy is my mother. Philanthropy is my grandmother. Those are the philanthropists I know. Right?
Deeply connected to the idea of hospitality, maybe?
Not even hospitality, because hospitality is still one way, right? It's somebody inviting you in, right? Sure. Reciprocity is, I need you as much as you need me.
Right.
And this thing never actually stops, right? It doesn't mean it's balanced, because sometimes I need you 80% and you need me 50%. Like, it changes. It's alive. It's always moving, sure. And it's always connected, and it's always proximate.
Yeah, any good existentialist would say that I only know myself in relationship to others, right?
Right.
100%.
Yeah, which brings us back to community, and we hope support and leaning on one another, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of, landing on the ground with a clipboard in hand, maybe we should land on the ground with a blank notepad in hand and a couple of pens, right? And sit down and spend some more time listening. I mean, this has been one of the things I've certainly, and many others have criticized the development sector for, is, is that we've got it all sorted out and we're going to bring it your way.
Yeah, it's a prescribing.
Right? Yeah, very prescriptive.
Yeah.
And David, I would suggest not even a notepad. Right. Land on the ground and have a meal.
Yeah, have a meal together. Absolutely. Yeah, share a cup of coffee or tea.
Get into community. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's really, really wise advice. Definitely something I'm going to be thinking about a little more in the near future. This idea of the benevolence being freely conferred or bestowed. I can't remember the word that you guys used, but. Camila, what's the greatest threat? We've got to wrap it up soon, but what's the greatest threat to the charitable sector in this country? And I know that I don't like polarizing questions. They were, I really don't. And I just asked one. So there's more than one threat. I get it. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I would say not keeping their ears open and not getting to know their communities. Learning, listening, really being involved, not just going with the solution, quote unquote, because you guys can't see me, but I'm doing that. But really and genuinely and truly being involved. I think that's how I see it.
Participating.
Yeah. Refusal to listen.
Yeah.
Refusal to listen. I wanted to add to that, actually, David, because as I thought about this, it's like, okay, don't ask me this question because I can ream off a bunch of things. But I think one of the greatest threats for the sector is this propagation, and it picks up on what Anika was saying before, right? is this propagation of a singular narrative, a singular story of what philanthropy is. And one of the things that we knew, but we are also learning, right? We're also curious and hungry to get more information. Madej did, and Camilla was part of this research project that looked at philanthropy in parts of Africa and how it gets expressed. Mathoni, who is another contributor to the book, she and I wrote a piece around philanthropy. She did it in Kenya, and I talked about philanthropy in Jamaica, right? Anika, she's a sixth generation Canadian, and she speaks about philanthropy. Her mom, her grandmother, her people, right? And the thread that holds that whole thing together speaks of a different narrative of philanthropy. So it feels like it's in part of our DNA, regardless of where you may be in the diaspora. There's something that has held us together for centuries, and that is important to recognize. So the danger, I think, for the charitable sector is if they refuse to change their singular narrative and not open themselves up to these forms of valid, formal ways of giving and receiving.
It's good. I think quite easily this could become the longest podcast I've ever done. So, I mean, very easily. But we are going to have to wrap it up shortly. Anika and Nicole, are you talking about love by any chance? Anika, and I don't want to give too much away about the book, but this thing that has held us together, is that part of it? And Anika, you write about that.
Oh yeah.
At the end of the book, and I just so love that there's such a positive thematic element to this book, because I think on the surface people could look at it and say, wow, these guys are really critical, or wow, they're, you know what I mean, like just sort of be dismissive, right, because of the criticism. But you kind of really can't go there, because you do it in such a relational way, if that makes any sense. Yeah. But anyway, can you talk a tiny bit about that love component?
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the main questions I get from my family who've read the book is, oh, we got to your part and we were so surprised to learn you didn't tell any of your stories. I said, well, I did tell. What are you talking about? I did tell one of my stories.
Trust your family not to get it, right?
Oh, they were just like, we really wanted you to spill tea. And I was like, I spilled a lot of tea.
Funny.
But this time again, like individually, all of the authors chose their approach and how they wanted to do this. And I was no different. I wanted to challenge myself to write something new and fresh and different. And I wanted to write about love, and I wanted to write with a Black audience in my mind. And so it was out of that desire that I began to explore, well, what does love look like for me? And when did I experience it? And how did it show up for me? And that brought me back to the beginning of my fundraising career. And it really was it was just so beautiful, because the beginning of my career was centered around my personal history as well, right, which also has an application for Black people across the diaspora, right? Like, the legacy of love that has allowed us to survive atrocity and oppression and injustice for centuries, right? Wherever we find ourselves. And so I thought that was just a really beautiful message. Had no idea my story would end up at the end, didn't know where. As a matter of fact, I had the themes out of order until the book got put together. So I really didn't know where my story was going to go. And so it was a beautiful thing for it to be chosen to end the book. But I think it's an important point, in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of suffering, joy, but also love. And it's love that actually sees us through and has allowed us to survive.
I think it's a brilliant metaphor. As an editor, you didn't even know where your story was going to go. it was going to fit. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, isn't that kind of the craziness that we call this beautiful, tragic thing called life?
100%.
And David, I have to add this piece because and it certainly applied for Camilla, because Camilla is like, I'm doing freedom, right? That's where she was at. And
stake in the ground. Yeah.
And you read Camilla's story, and again, this thread of philanthropy from a youth and finding freedom in our collectivism, right? And it's absolutely beautiful. Anika knew that is what she wanted to write on, right? I don't think she thought about what the framing, but she had put that stake in that I want to do, as she said, she possibly she could have told a whole lot of other stories. Sure. That's what it was. And what is really nice, I think Anika mentioned, you used the word frame. And I think in writing the introductions and setting that context, and in ending up finishing on that note of love, I think the stories and the collections are framed within that context, and that, like, you can just take the story and throw it in because the frame is there. And Anika mentioned about, there is a giving, right? As she said, there's suffering, but the way we get through that is with hope and a heck of a lot of love. Like, if you had a recipe, you would say, sprinkle, don't even worry to measure how much love you need. Just grab a handful and just sprinkle it, because that's how we actually get by. And that story, as she said, we had no idea where it would fit. And it just feels like the introduction and that final story frames the collection in an amazing way.
Well, it's a beautiful bookend to Collecting Courage. And for all of you who need to get a copy, you can at collectingcourage.org. And I'm just saying, Anika, you wouldn't have spilled so much tea had you been drinking from a Collecting Courage mug. Just saying.
It's coming.
It's coming, don't worry.
It's beyond excellent.
That's right. So hey, April 16th. We might, is that right? That is the date, isn't it? Yeah, we're going to be back. Yeah, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. People are going to hear about that on social. We've got a panel discussion with a good, almost all of the authors, actually, I think.
That's right.
And we're looking forward to it. And honestly, I knew we would barely get out of the gate today. And what a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for your time and for taking us a little deeper. And the collection is Collecting Courage. We have Anika Allen, Camilla Pereira, and Nicole Salmon here with us today on Face to Face. Thanks so much for taking the time with me today. Really a real pleasure.
Thanks, David.
Thank you so much.